Have you ever met someone who seemed perfect, charming, calm under pressure, generous, thoughtful, the kind of person others admire, trust, even follow, but something about them didn't sit right? They never raised their voice, they never lost their temper, and yet in their presence you felt a subtle chill, a flicker of unease, like you were being seen, but not as yourself, like a story about you had already been written and you were being cast into a role you never chose. What if I told you that person could be the most dangerous kind of human being? Not because they scream or attack or manipulate you openly, but because they believe, deep in their bones, that they don't have a dark side. And because of that belief, they will unconsciously make you carry it. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, didn't fear open aggression or overt toxicity. He feared something far more subtle and far more lethal. He wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Why? Because those who cannot accept themselves, who cannot face their own inner chaos, their repressed anger, their envy, cruelty, or control, project those traits outward, not deliberately, not maliciously, but unconsciously. And in doing so, they don't just distort their own perception of reality. They rewrite yours too. They will accuse you of intentions you never had, punish you for emotions you never felt, convince others that you are the problem, while they remain cloaked in the armor of virtue. And they'll believe it, with absolute certainty. By the time you realize what's happening, the damage is already done. Your reality has been rewritten, your reputation quietly eroded, and worst of all, you've begun to doubt your own truth. This is not just manipulation. It's not narcissism. It's deeper, older, more unconscious. It's what Jung called shadow projection, and it's only the beginning. Because shadow projection is just the first symptom of something far darker. A mind that is no longer in relationship with itself. A psyche split in two. And Jung warned us, when that split deepens and the shadow grows unchecked, it doesn't stay hidden. It takes control. So stay with me, because what you're about to learn could protect your mind, your identity, and your sanity. This is the most dangerous psychological sign in a person, according to Carl Jung. And chances are, you've already met it, or worse, it might be closer than you think. So what exactly is shadow projection, and why did Carl Jung consider it the most dangerous sign in a person? To understand that, we need to go deep into the psyche. Jung believed that every one of us carries a hidden side within, a psychological shadow. It's not evil. It's not malicious. It's simply unseen. It contains all the parts of ourselves we've rejected or disowned. Our anger, our envy, our lust for control, our fears, our impulses, our wounds. Everything that didn't fit the image we were taught to present to the world, we buried. That mask we wear to be accepted? Jung called it the persona, the polished version of ourselves we show to parents, partners, colleagues. But what happens to all the parts that don't fit behind that mask? They don't disappear. They wait. And over time, if we refuse to face them consciously, they slip out unconsciously in ways far more dangerous. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And the most destructive way it directs our lives? Projection. Imagine this. Someone believes deeply that they are calm, kind, selfless. They pride themselves on being composed, rational, good. But underneath that persona, their shadow simmers with rage, with jealousy, with a hunger for power. And instead of acknowledging those qualities within themselves, they start to see them in you. Suddenly, you're the selfish one, the manipulative one, the angry one. They're not lying. They're not faking it. In fact, they're more convinced than anyone that what they see is real, because their brain has rewritten the story to protect their fragile self-image. Modern neuroscience backs this up. Dr. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford showed that during moments of intense projection, the brain lights up in the same way it does during delusional episodes. The neural filters literally shift. Reality itself gets bent to match the unconscious narrative. And it's not just their perception that changes, it's yours too. This is what psychologists call a reality distortion field. The projector's absolute certainty pulls others in. Friends, family, colleagues. Slowly, people around you start to look at you differently, doubt you, whisper, avoid. They don't see you anymore. They see the version of you that lives in someone else's unconscious. And worst of all, you begin to question yourself. This isn't ordinary conflict. This is psychological gaslighting without intent. It's not manipulation. It's possession. A person has become hijacked by their own shadow, and they're using you as the battlefield. Jung saw this firsthand. In 1913, he treated a patient who was articulate, generous, and outwardly compassionate, a model citizen. But something felt off. Everyone the patient described, family, co-workers, even close friends, was, in his words, deceitful, manipulative, cruel. The more Jung listened, the more alarmed he became, because each of those accusations was a perfect reflection of what the patient himself refused to see within. 6 months later, the patient had wrecked multiple relationships, gotten 2 co-workers fired, and driven his brother to a nervous breakdown. And through it all, he believed himself to be the victim, completely innocent. In reality, he was the epicenter of destruction, and he didn't even know it. Jung realized the most dangerous people don't always know what they're doing, and that's exactly what makes them so dangerous. So how do you spot this in the real world? There are 5 red flags, and when you see them together, run. First, absolute certainty. They don't ask questions. They don't wonder. They say, "You're selfish. You're jealous. You're trying to control me." Not maybe. Not I feel. They speak like they're reading your mind, and they're never wrong. Second, immunity to evidence. You try to explain. You clarify. You show receipts, timelines, messages, context. It doesn't matter. The more you speak, the more certain they become. In fact, they twist your defense into more evidence that you're guilty. Third, emotional intensity disproportionate to reality. You forget to text back, and they explode. You set a boundary, and they crumble. You say no, and suddenly you're an abuser. Their reactions don't match the facts. They match the unresolved trauma hiding in their shadow. Fourth, perpetual victimhood. Every story ends the same. They were mistreated, manipulated, betrayed. The people change, but the script stays identical, and they're always the one who got hurt. Fifth, recruitment. They don't just attack you, they build alliances, carefully, subtly. Conversations that sound like concern or just sharing are actually campaigns, designed to make others see you through the same distorted lens. This is when things escalate, rapidly. Jung mapped out the stages. It starts with small accusations. You shrug it off as a misunderstanding. Then it hardens into certainty. They stop listening. They stop questioning. They know. Next, everything you do becomes evidence. Neutral acts, your silence, your tone, your body language, are reinterpreted through their story. Then they start talking to others. I'm worried about them. Something feels off. They sound gentle, thoughtful, but the damage begins to spread. Eventually, others start to see you differently. You find yourself explaining, defending, trying to remember what actually happened. Finally, you're alone, isolated, excluded, not for anything you've done, but for what someone else could not face inside themselves. This is not rare. It happens in families, friend groups, relationships, workplaces, even spiritual communities. And here's the horror. The more unconscious they are, the more powerful their projection becomes, because they radiate certainty. And in a world full of people craving clarity, certainty is seductive. But certainty is not truth. In fact, Jung believed the most trustworthy people are the ones who doubt themselves, who question their own motives, who ask, what part of this is me? Because those who don't ask that question will make you answer for their darkness. Projection is not the end. It's the beginning. Because when someone refuses to look at their own shadow, that shadow doesn't go away. It grows. It adapts. It seeks control. And if it grows large enough, it begins to consume the entire psyche. That's when we cross into something even more dangerous. Not unconscious projection, but conscious righteousness, where the person no longer simply believes they're right, but that they are the voice of truth itself. And in Jung's psychology, that's a sign that something far bigger than the ego has taken hold. And when that happens, the danger doesn't just stay personal, it becomes archetypal. Stay with me, because the next sign is even more chilling than shadow projection. It's called ego inflation, and it has destroyed families, movements, even entire nations. There's something even more dangerous than unconscious projection. It's when the ego stops being merely blind and begins to believe it's divine. This is what Carl Jung called ego inflation. Inflation doesn't mean arrogance in the typical sense. It's not loud, it's not boastful, it's not someone saying, "I'm better than you." No, ego inflation is quieter, it's deeper, and far more dangerous. It happens when the human ego, our limited, fragile sense of self, identifies with something vast and archetypal, something it cannot possibly contain. The person no longer sees themselves as just a person. They believe they are the savior, the prophet, the truth teller, the righteous judge. They don't say, "I have good intentions." They say, "I represent the good." They don't say, "I think this is right." They say, "This is what's right, period." And that's the difference. This isn't narcissism. It's not vanity. It's possession. The ego is no longer humble. It has been taken over by a larger-than-life archetype. And once that happens, the person speaks and acts as if they carry a divine authority. Jung warned, the inflation has nothing to do with the ego, but with the identification of the ego with a self-image which exceeds its proper limits. In other words, they are no longer aware of being human. They've merged with a role, a symbol, an ideal, and they believe it with absolute conviction. Unlike ordinary narcissists, who are easy to spot, inflated individuals often appear enlightened. They talk about truth, about healing, about justice, about love. They seem spiritually evolved, deep, charismatic, but there's no room for disagreement, no tolerance for challenge, no humility in the face of mystery. Disagree with them, and you're not just wrong. You're evil. You're part of the problem. You're resisting the divine force they believe they represent. This is the root of cults, of ideologies that demand obedience, of revolutions that eat their own, because the inflated person doesn't see people anymore. They see pawns, threats, supporters, enemies. You're either with them or against the truth. And the most terrifying part? They believe they're saving you. This is why inflated individuals are so charismatic, so persuasive, so dangerous. They speak with the voice of certainty in a world full of doubt, and people follow that voice, not because it's wise, but because it makes them feel safe. Jung observed this during the rise of totalitarian leaders in Europe. Men who claimed to speak for the people, for truth, for God. They weren't just leaders, they were symbols, and their followers didn't just obey, they believed. You can still see it today. In spiritual communities where a teacher is never questioned, in political spaces where dissent is seen as betrayal, in relationships where one partner claims moral high ground while eroding the other's sense of reality. So how do you recognize ego inflation before it consumes everything around it? Watch how a person reacts to disagreement. Do they lean in or shut down? Do they reflect or do they double down? A person in inflation doesn't process feedback as feedback. They hear it as blasphemy. Your challenge becomes a threat to the cosmic order they believe they represent. And they will do whatever it takes to restore that order, even if it means isolating you, punishing you, or smearing you, all while claiming to be doing good. Jung said, the bigger the inflation, the more dangerous the collapse. And that's the tragic irony, because inflated individuals cannot sustain this divine identity forever. Eventually, the psyche cracks, the mask slips, the denied shadow, so long suppressed, erupts. And when it does, the destruction is often total. But by then, the damage is done. To relationships, to communities, to minds. Because when someone identifies not just with being right, But with being righteous, they stop seeing others as human. And once that happens, anything becomes justified. This is the danger of ego inflation. Not that it's loud, but that it's holy. Not that it's toxic, but that it believes it's pure. This isn't just psychological, it's mythological. The inflated person becomes a living archetype, a walking symbol of salvation or judgment. But behind that glowing image is a frightened ego, terrified of facing its own shadow. And when that terror takes over, no truth can get in. But Jung didn't just warn us about the ego that inflates. He also warned about the person who hides behind a mask so perfect that not even they remember what's underneath. And that brings us to the next sign, one that may be standing right in front of you, smiling, polished, impeccably kind, but hollow. And when the mask breaks, so does everything you thought was real. Have you ever met someone who always knows what to say? They never raise their voice. They're polite, empathetic, patient, thoughtful, always appropriate. But somehow, they don't feel real. You laugh with them, but something's off. You confide in them, but it doesn't land. You're in a conversation, but you can't shake the feeling that they're playing a role. This isn't just social charm. This is something deeper, more disturbing. Carl Jung called it persona identification, and he believed it's one of the most dangerous psychological states a person can enter. See, the persona is the mask we wear to function in society. It's necessary. It helps us navigate relationships, careers, expectations. But the danger begins when we forget it's a mask. Jung wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself and others think one is." In other words, the persona is a performance. It's curated, controlled, safe. But what happens when a person becomes so identified with that performance? They lose access to their real self. You get someone who's perfect, but empty, polished yet disconnected, nice but strangely unsettling. They never show their flaws. Never lose control, never reveal doubt or contradiction. And that perfection, it's the red flag. Because Jung discovered that when someone invests all their psychic energy into the persona, into the performance of being good, nice, or harmless, their shadow doesn't disappear. It festers. And when the mask is too tight, the shadow becomes explosive. You've probably seen it. That moment when someone who's always composed suddenly snaps. When kindness turns to cruelty in a blink. When decades of self-restraint collapse into one terrifying outburst. Jung warned that the more perfect the persona, the more chaotic the shadow. It's like sealing a pressure cooker and forgetting the heat is still on. And here's the terrifying part. Sometimes, they don't even know the mask has taken over. They've played the role for so long, they've forgotten their acting. They believe they are the role. They've confused their image with their identity. And that confusion doesn't just hurt them, it hurts you. Because when you interact with someone who has become their persona, you're not in a real relationship. You're engaging with a facade. It's why you feel drained after being around them. Why your gut whispers, something's missing. Your brain senses the dissonance, even if you can't explain it. Modern neuroscience reveals that we have mirror neurons, specialized cells that detect subtle inconsistencies between a person's words, facial expressions, and body language. And when those signals don't match, our brain sends out a quiet alarm. That's why someone who's perfect can still make you feel anxious. Why you leave the conversation feeling off. It's your psyche warning you, this isn't real. But the real danger comes when the persona cracks. When life challenges their image, when failure, shame, or exposure threatens the role, they panic. They can't adapt. They can't grow. Because there's no deeper self to return to. And what happens next? Shadow eruption. All the anger, control, fear, and unmet needs they've denied for years come flooding out. Sometimes it's a quiet betrayal. Sometimes it's an explosive meltdown. Sometimes it's something far worse. Jung's close collaborator, Marie-Louise von France, warned that those with overly perfect personas are the ones most likely to experience sudden episodes of psychological collapse or destructive behavior. Because when the mask breaks, there's nothing underneath to hold them together. So how do you know when someone is persona identified? It's not always obvious. They're not violent. They're not loud. But look for these signs. They never admit fault. They always say the right thing, even when it feels forced. They avoid vulnerability like it's a disease. Their emotions seem rehearsed, like lines from a play. And when you challenge their image, they react, not like a person being questioned, but like a mask being torn. They may withdraw. They may retaliate. But most of all, they'll make you the problem. Because if they admit the mask isn't real, they risk everything. Their relationships, their identity, their very sense of existence. Jung saw persona identification as a betrayal of the self, not just to others, but to your own soul. He warned, the man who wears the mask forgets the face beneath it. But here's the deeper tragedy. The more someone hides behind the persona, the more alone they become. They're admired, respected, even loved, but never seen. And the longer they remain unseen, the darker their shadow grows. Until one day, it breaks free. And when it does, it's no longer just about the person. It's about what has taken possession of them. Because in Jungian psychology, when the self is fractured, something else moves in. A force older than you, larger than you, and far, far more dangerous. This is archetypal possession, and it's not a metaphor. It's a reality Jung spent his life trying to understand and protect us from. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and felt like they weren't fully there? Like the person you knew had vanished and something else was looking back at you? The same face, the same voice, but the presence was different, colder, heavier, almost ancient. Carl Jung had a name for this terrifying phenomenon: archetypal possession. It happens when a person becomes overtaken by a primordial force, an archetype so powerful it eclipses their individual identity. They're no longer acting as themselves. They're channeling something collective, something transpersonal. Jung believed that archetypes are the building blocks of the human psyche, universal patterns that live in the unconscious of all people. We all carry them: the mother, the hero, the martyr, the victim, the warrior, the savior, the judge. These forces are not bad. They shape myths, religions, art, and identity. But when someone becomes completely identified with an archetype, without conscious awareness, it's like being possessed by a god. And gods don't compromise. The person becomes monolithic, rigid, utterly convinced of their role in the world. They might become the eternal victim, always wounded, always suffering, demanding endless rescue, the righteous warrior, convinced they are fighting evil, projecting darkness onto everyone who disagrees, the divine parent, treating others like children in need of control, for their own good. And here's the terrifying part. They don't know it's happening. To them, it feels like purpose, like mission, like divine truth. But to everyone around them, it feels suffocating. Their tone changes. Their gaze becomes fixed. They speak in absolutes. They lose humor, curiosity, flexibility. You can't reason with them because you're not speaking to a person anymore. You're confronting an archetype. Jung called this the most alarming sign of psychological danger. Because the possessed individual no longer reflects, they radiate. They don't have opinions. They deliver proclamations. They're not acting from personal wounds anymore. They've been activated by something far bigger and far more impersonal. And the scariest thing, they become charismatic. People are drawn to them. They speak with certainty, authority, fire. And in a world full of confusion, that kind of fire spreads fast. Jung watched how entire political movements, religious cults, and ideologies took root, not through evidence, but through archetypal possession. One possessed individual lights the match. Others gather for warmth. Before long, a collective delusion is burning down reality itself. This is how fanatics are born. Because every archetype has two faces: the savior and the tyrant, the healer and the manipulator, the wise one and the destroyer. Jung warned, the more divine the person appears, the more critical it is to examine the shadow they deny. You see, when someone is possessed by an archetype, they don't just perform it, they become it, and in doing so they lose contact with their own moral compass. This is how people commit acts they swore they'd never do, and then rationalize it, or forget it entirely. Jung documented cases where possessed individuals, after lashing out, sabotaging, or even harming others, experienced partial amnesia or spun elaborate stories to justify behavior that clearly contradicted their values. Because in that moment, they weren't in control. And if you're in their orbit, you may find yourself caught in the pull of that archetype too. You stop seeing nuance. You feel pressured to conform. You begin playing a role you never chose. This is how people lose themselves inside someone else's story. But Jung wasn't the only one who saw this. Mystics throughout history warned of the same thing. Zen masters called it Zen sickness, the trap of believing your own spiritual purity. Sufis warned of the veil of light, an illusion more dangerous than darkness, because it masquerades as truth. The Christian mystics spoke of discernment of spirits, the wisdom to know what's divine and what only appears to be. So how do you know when someone's been overtaken? You'll feel it. A strange glow in the eyes, a voice that sounds rehearsed, a message that once felt wise, but now feels absolute. They don't speak to you. They speak through you, and they demand you play your part. But you don't have to. You can step back. You can observe without submitting. And most importantly, you can stay rooted in your own center. Because the moment you recognize the archetype, without being absorbed by it, you break its spell. And that's the difference between possession and awareness. But there's one more sign Jung warned us about, and it's one that hides in plain sight. A person repeating the same drama, the same wound, the same heartbreak, over and over again. Always with different people, always with the same ending. And the more you care, the more likely they are to cast you in the story they refuse to heal. Have you ever watched someone walk into the same disaster again and again? Different relationship, different job, different friend group, but somehow the same heartbreak, the same betrayal, the same collapse. And every time they say the same thing. Why does this keep happening to me? Carl Jung had a name for this, a name for the invisible force pulling people back into the same suffering, as if caught in a loop they can't escape. He called it the compulsion to repeat. At first, it seems like bad luck, coincidence, maybe a toxic pattern in relationships. But if you look closer, it's more like a script, one that's been running for years. Jung believed that when we don't process our earliest emotional wounds, when we leave them in the unconscious, they don't simply fade. They recreate themselves again and again. Not because we want them to, but because the psyche is trying desperately to resolve the unresolved. This is the tragedy. The repetition isn't punishment. It's a cry for healing. But when the wounds remain unconscious, the person doesn't realize they're the one writing the story. They keep choosing partners who abandon them, bosses who belittle them, friends who betray them, and each time, they're shocked, heartbroken, blindsided. But the plot never changes. Only the characters do. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And if you get too close to someone in the grip of this compulsion, something strange starts to happen. You start to feel pulled into their story. Without realizing it, you become the betrayer, the abandoner, the villain, not because you are, but because they need you to be. The psyche demands a recreation of the original wound, and you've been cast in the role of the one who causes it. This is what Jung called negative synchronicity, the eerie pattern where unconscious trauma orchestrates encounters that repeat the original injury. The person emits a kind of psychic signal, drawing in people and situations that mirror their unresolved past. It's not just emotional. Modern neuroscience has found that trauma literally rewires the brain, creating neural pathways that expect rejection, abandonment, or attack. And what the brain expects, it often unconsciously seeks. This is the cruel irony. The very people trying hardest to escape their pain are the ones most likely to repeat it. And unless they bring the wound into consciousness, it never ends. You might be their friend, their partner, their therapist. But sooner or later, if the script requires a villain, you'll become one. Because the repetition must be fulfilled. So how do you protect yourself? First, recognize the pattern. Listen for repeated phrases, familiar storylines, the same emotional climax told with different names and faces. Second, check your gut. Do you feel like you're being pulled into something you didn't start? Do you feel blame for something that doesn't belong to you? Step back, because you may be walking into a storm that has nothing to do with you. Jung warned us, people stuck in repetition aren't malicious. They're wounded. But wounds left in the dark don't heal. They haunt. And if you don't see the pattern, you might mistake someone's unfinished trauma for destiny and lose yourself trying to fix it. But there is hope, because Jung didn't leave us in the darkness of projection, inflation, persona, possession, and repetition. He pointed to a path out, a path that doesn't deny the shadow, but integrates it, a path not to perfection, but to wholeness. And it begins where all healing begins, with the courage to face your own darkness and no longer project it onto someone else. You've seen it now, the shadows that twist reality, the egos that swell until they rupture, the masks that suffocate the self, the ancient forces that hijack the human mind, the traumas that repeat like broken records. All of them signs of danger. But what if the greatest danger isn't the shadow itself? What if the real danger is in pretending it doesn't exist? Carl Jung didn't believe that people were doomed by their unconscious. He believed they were enslaved by it until they chose to face it. He wrote, "I would rather be whole than good." What did he mean? He meant that the pursuit of being good, of appearing perfect, kind, harmless, is often a disguise, a prison, a way to avoid the messy truth of who we really are. But when we deny our shadow, our anger, our envy, our need for control, our pain, we don't erase it. We just lose control of it. The shadow doesn't go away, just becomes unconscious. And what is unconscious in us rules us, silently, automatically, relentlessly. So what's the alternative? Integration. To look directly into the darkness and say, yes, that's me. Not to indulge it, not to justify it, but to own it. Jung called this the path towards psychological maturity, to recognize that you are capable of everything you fear in others. Yes, you are capable of manipulation, of cruelty, of jealousy, of abandonment, of destruction. And when you accept that, really accept it, you stop needing to project it onto others. You stop creating villains where there are none. You stop demanding sainthood from yourself. You stop turning relationships into battlegrounds for your unresolved wars. And instead, you become trustworthy, not because you're perfect, but because you're aware. This is what transformation looks like. It's not grand. It's not glamorous. It's quiet. It's a moment when you're about to lash out and you pause. It's when you feel the rage rise. And instead of projecting it, you ask, what is this really about? It's when someone hurts you and you don't collapse into victimhood. You get curious. It's when you admit, yes, I wanted control. Yes, I felt envy. Yes, I was scared. And from that honesty comes freedom. Modern neuroscience confirms what Jung intuited a century ago. When we bring unconscious material into awareness, the brain forms new neural pathways, connecting emotional centers with the prefrontal cortex, where reflection and choice live. Integration isn't just spiritual, it's neurological, and its result is something rare, something real, wholeness. The integrated person doesn't deny their darkness. They carry it consciously. They walk through life knowing what they're capable of, both light and dark. And because of that, they don't need to control others. They don't need to prove they're good. They don't need to destroy what they can't face in themselves. They become safe, not because they're tame, but because they're true. And there's a beauty to that. It's in the spiritual teacher who admits to anger, the parent who apologizes, the leader who says, I was wrong. It's in the human being who doesn't shine a spotlight on their virtues, but carries a quiet authority that makes you feel seen, not judged. That's the sign, the real sign of transformation. Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So now you've seen the darkness, not just in others, but maybe in yourself. And that's good, because awareness is the first step. Not fear, not shame, not denial, just the willingness to see clearly. So if you've recognized yourself in any of these patterns, projection, inflation, persona, possession, repetition, don't turn away. Turn inward. The shadow is not here to destroy you. It's here to awaken you, to show you where you're not free, to show you what you're ready to heal. And if you dare to face it, not with judgment, but with honesty, you don't just become better, you become whole. And that is the rarest kind of power. Because the most dangerous person is not the one who feels their darkness. It's the one who pretends they have none. But the most powerful person is the one who sees it all and chooses to act with awareness. So look closer, at them, at yourself, and remember, you are not just light. You are not just shadow. You are the one who holds them both. And in that holding lies your freedom.